speaker this morning, our presenter, is Judith Moses, who I want to thank has taken time out of her very busy life to, in a sense, more than in a sense, pinch hitting for our original speaker, and Judith very graciously agreed to make that, to be with us today. She is president of Judith Moses Consulting, and I know that among other things, she does pro bono work with Indigenous nations in the North, things like finding drinkable water and other issues, housing. She's worked in various positions with the federal government. She has a Bachelor of Arts from the University of Guelph. Has also studied at the Oxford Center for Management Studies. And she has the distinct privilege of being the Deputy Prolocutor of General Synod. So she has been very involved in the National Church in the last number of years. She has been chair of the General Synod's Strategic Planning Working Group and Jubilee Commission. The name alone makes me exhausted. So she has worked closely with the Anglican Council of Indigenous Peoples, and she corrected me, she is not a member, but she has worked closely with them and was part of the covenant of our way of life document. She's a member of the Delaware Nation of the Six Nations, which, if you count them up, Delaware makes 7. And she'll probably correct me if I don't get this quite right, but the word is that the Delaware who were living in what became the United States came to visit their cousins, the Mohawks, for a weekend and haven't gone home. And that was back in the 18th century. She and her husband, Peter Lyman, live in Shamcook. Well, throughout the pandemic, they also have a home in Toronto, and Peter also is still very much involved in business and in philanthropy. They have 3 sons, and they now have 2 Ukrainian refugees living in their home in Toronto and are waiting the arrival of 5 more who will be living with them in their now expanded house, because they expanded a few years ago in anticipation of this in Shamcook. So, Judith Moses.
Thank you, John. I'm really pleased to be here this morning. John didn't mention that he's my rector at the church in St. Andrews, All Saints Church. So when he asked me to come, there was no way I could say no. I asked the organizers how much time I have, and they said all day. So settle in. I'm going to talk this morning about some work that I'm doing at the national church level with General Synod. And as John mentioned, I chair the Strategic Planning Working Group. So I'm going to talk first about that work, and then I'm going to move into the work that's being done within the Indigenous Church, because they are related, and I will show you exactly how they are. This presentation may be a bit of a deviation from what you've been discussing so far. The national level sometimes is quite obscure to many people, but having said that, the work that we've been doing with the Strategic Planning Working Group really has work that's come from your volunteers and your parishioners. So what I'm going to present to you is what came out of a process that we have been involved in since before the pandemic. So the topic, hope, there are many definitions, and one thing I'm not going to spend a lot of time on today is the biblical hope definition of a forward-looking faith and a confident belief that the Word of God gives joy, peace, and patience in the present. So there is the word hope, this expectation and a desire for certain things to happen, or to wish or aspire for a specific thing, or to be in a state of aspiring to something good. To be hopeful, to be in a positive state of hope, and a belief that something good can happen. One thing that we have focused on in the strategic planning working group is taking that hope and grounding it so that it is not just wishful thinking. Having said that, we are up against a lot, and you're all familiar with the trends in the Anglican Church of Canada. Neil Elliott did some work in 2019 predicting that in 20 years, we would have no members left. Having said that, nobody believes in straight line projections. And once you see those numbers, you spring into action. So we do know, as we entered into the pandemic, and we began a very classical strategic planning approach. The last strategic plan in the Anglican Church was a 10-year plan. No one in their right mind today does 10-year plans. It just doesn't happen. Even 3-year plans are suspect. So we found ourselves all of a sudden in what Susan Beaumont describes as a liminal time, when you have left or are about to leave the tried and true, but have not yet been able to replace it with anything else, when you're between your old comfort zone and any possible new answer. And she goes on to talk about when the continuity of tradition disintegrates and uncertainty about the future fuels doubt and chaos. It's in a liminal season, it is simply not helpful to pretend that we understand what needs to happen next. But leaders can still lead. So liminal times require leaders who can practice what Susan Beaumont calls presence. And you'll see Susan Beaumont throughout this. She was a tremendous inspiration for our work. And there is a supposition that all truly great innovations are incubated in liminality, and that some of God's greatest works can occur in liminal space. And these are all quotations from Susan Beaumont's book, How to Lead When You Don't Know Where You're Going. So we had to stand back from that traditional strategic planning work. I've spent many, many years doing strategic plans in the public and private sector. So like everyone else, we were lost. We did not know what we were going to do, how we were going to lead this. The primate wanted the work to continue. So we decided to stand way back and adopt a very humble approach to strategic planning, which involved deep, deep listening and learning. We did not know when we went into this what we would get out of it, but we did know that there was no way that we could produce a traditional strategic plan. The approach that we took was to set up a series of 12 listening groups across the country, and these were all representative groups. Most of them met 3 times, some more, but the groups were, there was an Indigenous group, there's a group of church executive officers, diocesan councils, communication specialists, congregational development and mission people, executive officers, financial officers, bishops, young clergy, the Council of the North, and then a few youth sessions. So this, we realized that this was going to be a very messy process, and a number of us in the strategic planning working group have had some experience in managing these kinds of processes, but we used a diverge converge planning model, recognizing that people were going to be all over the map, and that at certain points it was our job to try to bring them back together. It was also a very biblically centered approach. We used a gospel-based discipleship approach, and each session was grounded in a relevant biblical passage that we discussed, and the lessons that we took from that we carried into our work. The conversations in the listening groups, and by the way, of course, this is all on Zoom, and you'll recall at that time, many of us were not terribly experienced in Zoom, and the trials and tribulations of getting Zoom to work and getting people there on time and asking them to unmute when they spoke. So all of that stuff was present in spades. But we got to know each other, and the conversations broadly identified issues around worship and faith, structures and processes in the church, leadership and sustainability both from a climate point of view as well as an institutional point of view. We talked about identity and purpose, social justice and advocacy, and new ways of being, which in those days were virtual. And then Indigenous self-determination. Indigenous self-determination has been going on almost on a separate track, and a lot of people weren't aware of the work that was happening. The Indigenous working group decided they were going to keep that work separate. And I'll get into some of the reasons for that shortly. The biggest issue that we confronted during these consultations was in the area of pastoral care. And when our clergy and our volunteers are exhausted, when we were dealing with fatigue and lockdowns and how to carry out ministry under such difficult circumstances. And then, of course, the emergence of lay roles in the middle of all of this. Some of the observations that came out of this work. Number one is that we did observe that the pandemic accelerated existing trends in the church and exposed shortcomings in other places. On the diversity issue was an example with George Floyd emerging, and we all were at home. We had a lot of time to reflect on some of these things. It also magnified social and economic inequality and challenged our Anglican traditions and ability to respond to social need. Some of you will be in parishes where that was so real. I had a lot of contact with some of the urban parishes at the time, and when social service agencies closed their doors, literally, the only people who were still ministering were some of the churches. But of course, the ability to gather was just, when we look back on it now, it's hard to imagine we've come from that, but that was indeed what was happening at that time. The pandemic in many ways also brought us closer together. Technology was a benefit, and the frequency of meeting. We met more often because we could. We didn't have to worry about travel, and I'm sure many of you have been involved in organizing events like this, where there's a huge logistical challenge to bringing people together. So even though we complained a lot about it at first, we realized in retrospect that it was a benefit. We also learned that we're quite adaptable. It didn't feel that we were adaptable when we were in the middle of the pandemic, but as we shared the lessons that all of us learned in the pandemic, we were able to point out progress, both in how our leaders managed and how our congregations coped. And the other is that there was some light shed on some future roles for the National Church, for General Synod. And these were really nascent at the time, but things around the role of connecting and bringing people together in conversation, convening working groups, and communications became the lifeblood for many of us during the pandemic. And I guess most importantly, the main observation is that the central importance of our faith was affirmed in spades during that. There were a whole bunch, and I'm not going to spend too much time on these, but issues I identified around worship and faith, spiritual health, technology, relationships and collaboration, pastoral care, leadership, infrastructure, being the cost of maintaining our buildings, and issues around amalgamation, health and safety issues. This is all pre-vaccine, remember, so there were huge concerns around that and the changing government rules from one day to the next. The issue of community health and social justice. That, in retrospect, was perhaps a little bit of a mistake that I made in organizing this, because it was too big a group to really tease out all of the issues that were there. But it did cover issues like racism, in addition to things like homelessness and addictions and food security, economic security. It was a really, really big basket of issues. Sustainability, and the whole issue around survival of the human species. International everyone agreed it was important, but we were so busy focusing on our domestic challenges around COVID that unfortunately we did not lift our eyes up perhaps enough, and we relied a lot on PWRDF to represent us on the international front. And then finally, this was probably the biggest basket of issues that came out of this was around structure. And by that, we meant the rules, the impediments, the boundaries, and the ability to kind of communicate across silos in many respects. And the whole issue of white privilege came up in that context in terms of racism and the inability of our structure, at least to date, to incorporate white voices, including Indigenous voices. Those were some of the issues. Finances, of course, was huge, and a lot of complaints about diocesan assessments. And where do we put our money in mission versus mission focus versus managing our buildings? And then, of course, there was the Indigenous self-determination issue, and that was another huge area. The communities were more isolated. Elder deaths were just devastating for communities where these elder voices are so important to continuity of culture. And I'm sure all of you experience this, but the necessity of bringing lay roles much more into the picture. So some of the challenges that we needed to address came forward, and some of them I've already touched on. And I would say that a lot of these were not necessarily, I don't want to say they weren't real, but there are perceptions that people have about what we do that in some cases do become their reality. And one of them was around hierarchy and jurisdictional silos as between dioceses and the national church, and the need for us to work more harmoniously together. I mentioned the representation and inclusion of marginalized voices. A lot of people complain about the nimbleness of their either congregations or diocese or the national church to overcome rigid structure, process, and rules to get things done. They also talked about the unevenness of resource capacity across dioceses, and the fact that yes, we do have an ability to do some of that in terms of redistribution of resources, like to the Council of the North, but we don't have anything that we have, for example, constitutionally in the country around redistribution of wealth. Human limits to clergy roles I've touched on, and that was just so fundamental to everything. And when your clergy are ill or they're tired and they're not enthusiastic, that permeated some of the culture that we were experiencing at the time. People talked about divisive win-lose decision-making, and of course, the last General Synod, people are still reeling from that, and the climate that was produced, and questioning, is that the only way to make decisions? Surely there must be other ways that we are not as polarized. A lot of people felt that there was not enough focus on social justice issues in the church, on climate change. Where is our voice nationally and internationally? The whole issue of advocacy during the pandemic was also important, because governments were making policy, making changes to social support systems on the run. And there were many people who felt that they had to be out, in addition to doing everything else that we've been doing, they had to be out front also advocating with local and provincial governments for the kinds of changes that would accommodate the kinds of social services that we were were delivering, as well as our, our ability to hold services. There were a whole bunch of government issues there that required people to turn their attention to advocacy. And again, there was a sense that there wasn't enough of a focus on right relations and reconciliation. One of the key things, and it's one thing that I think that you'll see and hear more about, is the paucity of mechanisms across the church to engage on issues that really matter. And during the pandemic, there was such a hunger for people to be able to reach out, to talk to each other, to share experiences and to share insights. And one big example was around restructuring and what have other people learned who are decommissioning churches, and what were all the ins and outs of doing that. And I think it still is happening today. We're not really sharing the lessons learned on that. I'm having a little trouble with this. There we go. Whoops. Too many. Yeah, okay, here we go. So the listening groups, after accumulating all of this body of insight, began to talk about, well, what do we need to do about that? And there were huge doubts that even if we make all these changes, will it matter? Will people come back? Will people come to the Anglican faith? And we realized, as we discussed all this, that there were so many differing assumptions across the country about the need for change and why we would change. And so we talked about, well, if we did tackle some of these impediments, why are we doing this? Is it to deepen our faith? Is it to draw new members and retain our existing membership? Is it around conserving resources? Is it about reducing bureaucracy and the structures of the church? How do we simplify being church? And what does it mean to return to mission focus when many people believed we were already there? So there was a reality of all these different pressures and contexts across the country, at the diocesan level, at the regional level, and the community level. And we tried to not focus on the differences in the sense of polarizing, but rather to accept and to listen to the differences, because the pandemic gave us a real opportunity to not go into our corners, but to really hear each other in new ways. So I think that as we go forward, that's going to be a real challenge, is to respect and honor the differences that we do have across the country. There was a lot of convergence, though, on new strategic directions. And we talked at great length about a shared vision that could be adaptable to those differences that I've just mentioned, and address a variety of circumstances across the country. The North does not minister the same way as we do here or in downtown Toronto or Vancouver. So I think coming out of all of that, there was a sense that we're going through this whether we like it or not. And what we need is some kind of shared purpose in moving forward, things that would help us to get through the difficult parts, where we could look at things in the future with more passion and energy, to see the relevance to our communities, to share common values and mission and purpose, and a great hunger for hope beyond today's challenges. Now, that may not sound like rocket science. When you look back on it, we're here today and it doesn't feel like we've been through all that, but when you're in the middle of a pandemic, it was so important to people to have that in mind. I think this might be running out of batteries. So hope and being hopeful. So convergence emerged around what we call 5 transformational aspirations, all coming out of the listening process. And so very much a ground up process, with not a top down national process. We listened and We tried to bring some shape to what we were hearing. But around these aspirations, there was a sense that they could provide purpose and vision, that the right aspirations could be adaptable to the differing circumstances and contexts across the church, that they could address realities that both resonate across the church, but that require different, more targeted solutions in different parts of the country. New opportunities to connect, engage, and learn. I've mentioned that already, how important that was to people. A lot of new friendships were made too. We often did not have a chance to meet people in different communities across the country. So people really look forward to these listening groups. Providing a shared mission and planning focus across the church. And we were still thinking at that time that maybe there would be such a thing as a plan that could come out of all of this. And then finally, inspirational aspirations as drivers for reform. Why are we doing this? Where will it take us? Coming out of this, we came up with what we call 5 transformational aspirations. And these are still in draft. They're being worked on, but until General Synod meets next year in 2023, they remain draft. It started off as a list, and the top of the list was invites and deepens life in Christ. And as we began to tease all of this apart, we realized, of course, it's not just a list, even though it was number 1. It's central to everything that we're doing. So around that center core, we have, and moving over to the right, embracing mutual interdependence with the Indigenous Church, now called Sacred Circle. The third one was around nurturing right relationships among people of faith in local, national, and global communities and networks. The next one was around stewarding and renewing God's creation, protecting and sustaining the earth, and pursuing justice and mercy for all. And the final one was around championing the dignity of every human being and working to dismantle racism and colonialism. And so we went back, we crunched everything down and went back to the listening groups. We reconvened them again, and we did some wordsmithing. And this is basically what people have come up with. It's not cast in stone. And the intention isn't to debate this word versus that word, but to take them now and to work with them. And what we heard back from the listening groups was that they found these hopeful, they found them positive, they found them inspirational, that they were mission focused, that they resonated from wherever they came from. And people could see the potential for some real action. A lot of people thought that they were radical and post-colonial, and I think very much that depends on your perspective. And of course, people really liked the fact that life in Christ was at the core of all of this. And that when we put all that together, we came to the conclusion that this would define what a healthy church could look like. So the next steps moving forward in our change journey, the journey isn't finished. There is a tendency to want to get this all behind us. And one thing that Susan Beaumont talks about in her book is the concept of emergence. And she wrote this book before the pandemic. And I think she's changed some of her thinking, but the notion that we're going to emerge from this terrible situation into something new, and that things will become settled, there'll be a new normal. And that there'll be order coming out of chaos, that we would be shifting out of fixing something that's broken. But instead, the strategic planning working group is still trying to keep that open, that where we may not emerge from something and become something more coherent. We may have to live in this for some time. And while emergence may be what keeps some people going, the reality of a pandemic may be quite different. So we're trying to keep that notion open. But what we're doing over the next year, and I've just had confirmation yesterday from another diocese that is going to participate. So we're going to have 3 or 4 pilot projects at the diocesan level across the country. And they're going to take these aspirations and they're going to work with them. Not every single aspiration is going to be completely relevant to every diocese. There'll be different priorities, but we're going to see how that process works out. And the purpose of these projects will be to identify what the potential of these aspirations could look like in the church's future. How broad are they? Are they enabling enough? Is there enough scope for local context, for innovation, and for local or diocesan level priority setting? Do they provide an opportunity to do something radically different? And a definition of transformation is about doing something radically different. And do they address the disruptive change? It's a big word people are using a lot these days. As a catalyst, we've come through something. Can we use that as a springboard for doing something different? They are going to help to see what, rather than the new normal, what the next normal might look like, to demonstrate concrete action, to model a post-colonial world, and to create this notion of shared hope. And we're also, some of you may have seen, the Strategic Planning Working Group is now recruiting again from across the country, because we're finding that managing a project, or at least co-managing a project, requires a different set of insights and skills. So we are bringing some new minds to this. Part of what we've done too in environmental scanning, which is something that just about everybody does when you do a strategic plan, was just to take a quick look at how others are coping. And I just put some stuff together fairly quickly about some private and non-profit sector trends and the kind of language that's being used there. And this will just give you a sense of how others are seeing their post-pandemic context. So words like disruption equals irreversible change, change or die, clarify your brand, companies that maintain the status quo will fail, constantly look for creative innovation in everything you do, find alternatives that do not yet exist, disrupt or be disrupted, demonstrate impact or you will lose your stakeholders, and then doing strategic planning in real time and do scenario planning rather than strategic planning. So that's some of the language that you see out there. And the next page on some of the actions that people are taking that kind of relate to what we do. Donor management as an example. And I did a study of this last year, Canada, US. The nonprofit organizations that actually invested more in donor management during a period when everyone else was cost cutting actually did better than those that didn't. A lot of focus on metrics and performance tracking. On properties and the cost of maintaining physical sites, a lot of streamlining and consolidation and closing physical locations. Partnerships and mergers for greater market reach. We saw that both in the nonprofit sector in the last recession as well. And of course, the whole digital world and the connections there and the innovation around using the technologies available. In terms of the Pew and comparing that to private sector or nonprofit organizations, some of the questions coming out are, do people want our product? And what are the signs of change? What does a restless customer look like? What is critical? What are the things that only we can do? And let's focus our market share on that. Diversity, equity, and inclusion. There's a lot of research now that shows that really does pay off. And companies that have invested strongly had about 36% above average returns compared to those that did not. And then the final one, what are our competitors doing? And does that matter? The next slide on leadership, and that was one of the key things that came out of looking at what others are doing. And there's a lot more literature around this issue of hope as a cornerstone of good leadership during the pandemic. and that leaders need to identify the possible, inspire people to believe it, create opportunity to work together to do it, define purpose, especially across jurisdictions, bring people along on a collective journey as you're managing change, come up with multiple flexible pathways to success, create excitement about the journey in the future, provide active tools for people to work together, to connect, to learn, to share insights and lessons learned. One study by Dr. Shane Lopez, who spent a whole life on strengths, has done a book called Strengths-Based Leadership. He identifies, he interviewed a lot of employees in companies going through change, and he identified direction, faith, and guidance as words used for expectations of leaders. And this is in the private sector. And then the final one, of course, being a good leader is being able to make the tough choices and decisions that need to be made. So hope, coming back to our topic of hope, this work can't be done without hope and without working together across the church. So a couple definitions that I personally really like, and others can find their own, but hope is a belief that the future will be better than the present, along with the belief that you have the power to make it so. So that is moving it beyond the notion of wishful thinking. And my favorite one is this one. Hope is not naive, and hope is not an opiate. Hope may be the greatest single act of defiance against a politics of pessimism and a culture of despair. And then, of course, there's also, the famous Winston Churchill, never let a good crisis go to waste. So that brings me to the end of the first part of what I wanted to go through this morning. And I don't know whether people want to take a break now, John, or how you want to do this, but I wanted to go next into one of the pieces around the Indigenous church in the Mandela that you saw previously, and to talk about embracing mutual interdependence with the Indigenous church. So,
well, we're giving us one of the website what the practical way and theoretical the national church is doing for us, and as Churchill said, the crisis go to waste. And we're thankful for your leadership for providing at the national level. So there's a heart there. Fine line. So perhaps we could just open the floor for a few minutes to see if you have any questions on this section. Take a short break and then come back. Anyone have any questions, comments?
Just a couple. Around the word colonialism, I think for most of my history, I've been teaching that inheritance of calling and so that word has got a number of nuances.
it does.
And that I think needs to be thought through. And also, when we learn lessons from across the street, this used to be the home of the Maritime Conference. It used to be a huge United Church over here. There are parking blocks. They seem to be, how shall I say, I think too harsh, certainly the grade. They seem to be losing. And aren't there lessons we can learn just from their experience?
Yeah, absolutely. And on your first point around language, the Council of General Synod has had some huge discussions about language, and I rather than spend a lot of time breaking it down into a definition that 100% of people agree with, we decided to leave the language as is, and then allow people, I shouldn't say allow, but to have other people interpret what does that mean to you. And so the issue isn't around finding one word that we have, a definition. It's what does it mean to your parish, to your diocese, to your community. And so that was the thinking behind the enabling part of the word. I totally agree with you. It's a loaded word. It means so many different things in different parts of the country. And then your second point, absolutely. there's so much local experience to learn from. And unfortunately, these really good lessons never get shared at the national level. We don't know what is happening in the interior of British Columbia or the north that could benefit from that. So one of the things I think in the future is we have to be able to share these stories of what does it look like? What does success look like?
I am at a university and we're going through a kind of similar process of looking at various kinds of plans. And to my mind, looking at your Mandela, the one thing, and really the only thing that distinguishes your plan from our planning process is the thing in the center.
Okay.
And it seems to me that the thing in the center is kind of making a crucial point, which is that, you know, Christ is the Word made flesh. So he enters into history, but he's not simply a product and a, you know, defined and determined by that historical process. And that's where I wonder whether that, you know, so to my mind, this is the crucial place that needs to transform all of the assumptions going on. And I'm mindful of the language of hope is part of one of the texts we teach regularly in foundation program, Dante's Divine Comedy. And for him, hope is none of those things. Hope is our relationship to eternity and a confidence in our relationship with the eternal. So just how is this plan not simply conforming to the spirit of the world, rather than actually engaging in the very transformation and the distinctive kind of hope that belongs to the church?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, I've been waiting for this question.
I'm glad I set up.
No, that absolutely is the critical question. And I'm not going to pretend to have an answer to it because it's a very complex question. Having said that, though, there may be things that we can learn from the rest of the world who are going through similar situations, notwithstanding the center of that Mandela about our faith in Christ. And so, yes, it does distinguish us, but it does more than that. It's a profound center, and it's going to be magnified in different ways in different parts of the country. And I can talk a little bit later about you know, the Indigenous perspective on gospel-based discipleship as an example, how we live our faith and demonstrate our faith. You know, I think I mean, to me, I'm not a theologian, and I've only been involved in this work since the summer of 2019 when I was elected. But I've been able to pick up on it because I've done change management for my entire career. So there are many similarities, but the one that is transcendental, of course, is the one that you mentioned. And that's where I think there's a lot, if we can add those worldly other points there to that, I think, you know, we have a dynamite combination.
Oh yeah, the Word is made flesh.
The Word is made flesh.
There's that side, but there is the Word too, right?
Yeah.
I'm sure that we would be glad to hear anyone who has theological insights.
Absolutely. Yes, and feel free afterwards to drop me a line too, because I'd love to hear from you. Time does not permit.
Sure.
Some of the language towards the end and some of those things remind me of the stuff I hear in Marxist circles about creative destruction, which for Marx was sort of a grudging admiration for how capitalism was changing the globe, but in preparation for something better, different. A lot of the talk in this pandemic has been about, you know, we're all in this together and the world's changed, things like 9/11. I'm really afraid that almost nothing will change. And one, I know, don't want to parse the words all that much to understand what you're saying there, but a post-colonial future, I was expecting a decolonized maybe would be a better word, but in the African nations that were newly independent in the late 50s and 60s, there was a phenomenon that became known as neo-colonialism. And I'm kind of worried the future might be that if we're not really addressing it, I'm hoping this next section will help confront that and bring something there. But I did want to challenge one other phrase, I guess it was in about something to the effect. I was trying to write it down quickly, but try to maintain the status quo, basically on the toast or something like that. That didn't obviously say that exactly, but it was something about maintaining this equal failure, basically. And I just challenge that in the history of the church, that there's been lots of opposite realities of that. Where by maintaining the light and witness and worship of the church in the midst of things like the monks in the Dark Ages, for instance, this book, How the Irish Saved Civilization, things like that, that by maintaining that, while the world is changing around you, in a sense, your mission is changing because the world that you're maintaining the gospel in is changing around you and needs it more. Usually, certainly that's the case in our world. So I don't need it. If you want to say something in reaction to that, you can. But I just want to throw that out for us all to think about. And I kept having the new normal, next normal, whatever. I keep having the Bruce Coburn song going through my head. The trouble with normal is it always gets worse, right? But he's not writing from a despairing point of view. He's writing from the Christian, actually originally Anglican, I don't know if he still is or not, point of view, in which, like, one of those definitions of hope that I can live through things because I know it's going to get better and I have the agency to change it, basically. And that's not my hope. But my hope is, even if it does get worse, I do have hope, beyond myself. There's a transcendence, as you said, and that's what transforms me. Is what's going to transform the world. Right? It's not so much that I have the agency to, but that even if it's terrible, what's the phrase? Is situation. Is the situation hopeless? No problem. No. I know that one.
Yeah.
But situations. Anyway, I can't. I'll have to Google or something.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we could be here for the next 3 days on that question alone or longer. The examples I gave in the private sector are much more clear cut because sometimes, do or die is tomorrow. So I think we need to reflect a lot on that. And I mean, a lot of people say, well, smaller is probably good. I mean, smaller church is probably good because we can maintain what makes us strong, and we may just have fewer members. But I think it comes back to this notion of collective discussion by a group of people who own that church or property, and how do they see it? I mean, I don't think that we can dictate that. I think it's going to be different in every place. And if there's one thing that I learned from all of this, it is that the response will be a bit different because the social, economic, environmental context is different in every single community. Opportunity is different in every community, and I think we're still accumulating the insight that we gained during the pandemic. What did we gain? What did we lose? I don't think we know that yet. When we add it all up across the country, I mean, I know myself personally. I visited churches I never expected to visit during the pandemic, and a lot of us went back to old video recordings that actually had choirs singing. So there are advantages as well to being in a different kind of world. I don't know what the numbers look like today. We need Elliot, what's his first name? Neil Elliott, to collect those stories and tell, did you gain members and why did they come? I mean, those are really important questions. We need to know the answers to those.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions? Yeah.
Yes, so thank you so much. I serve in the Episcopal Church, and I think we have fairly similar, sort of response to this current crisis. The only difference, I think, and what I do appreciate is the center, Christ the center. But in terms of best practices, I've been quite inspired by what's happening in the Roman Catholic world, just in Nova Scotia, Divine Renovation was a ministry, a global ministry for the new evangelization. So I think that's why missing there, that I see missing in the Episcopal Church is where is the new evangelization, which also then follows up with the new discipleship, right? So how are we doing that?
Yeah, yeah.
And I think in terms of a fairly incarnational approach, I really commend this work. But what's missing is the new evangelization, and there are best practices.
Yeah, it was certainly was discussed, and I may have made a mistake not putting it in the slides, but with all of the pros and cons that you are familiar with, and different communities have different approaches to that. I think street ministries in Toronto have quite a different approach, where with a parish, for example, that doesn't have those kinds of social service outreach programs. Although a lot of people were called into service that never were in that kind of business before, or are forced to close down services during the pandemic. Like soup kitchens, the one in Newfoundland, they had to close down their, they provided furnishings for people coming out of either prisons or I guess, economic crisis, and all that had to close. So I think we have an emerging sense of what that is and what that might look like. But we had some pretty strong debates about that too. Some people did not see it, our future, in that evangelistic type of role. So
Fascinating.
yeah.
Just to say anecdotally, my parish, we were able to launch Alpha online.
Oh yes.
With profound success, with people joining us from all over the world.
Oh, that's
You
interesting.
can't do in person.
Yeah, yeah.
Which is fascinating.
That's a great example. Yeah. And I think there's one
Well, we're ready for a break, and then we'll come back in 10 minutes.
is to walk you through some of the work that's being done in the Indigenous Church. It corresponds to that piece of the Mandela right at the top about embracing mutual interdependence with the Indigenous Church. One thing I would just say before getting started is that there has been a real process of decolonizing that is going on within the Indigenous Church. I mean, just look at me, for example. We've had to go back and look at language, look at culture. Many things have been lost. And so we've had to talk to elders, and we may not get all the information that we need, but we have been trying to pull back some of the fundamentals of Indigenous worship across the country to the extent that we can remember it. And so we know that this work is going to be picked up by future generations. What I'm presenting to you is only going to be work that this group of people involved in drafting Our Way of Life document, the covenant. And we know that it's going to continuously evolve. And my role in working with the Anglican Council of Indigenous Peoples, I've been the scribe basically for the work we've been doing on the covenant. And my job was to hold the pen, and Indigenous people are great storytellers, and you have to really listen to find out the lesson in what you've heard. And so we have a couple of people who they tell amazing stories that would go on for a long time. Then my job was to say in 10 words, what was that? So it was an interesting process for me. But I guess what I'm asking for is tolerance for the Indigenous Church, as it has to work together on its own in order to rebuild itself. And so because there's so much healing still going on in the Indigenous Church, a lot of people aren't really ready to share yet. So this is going to continue for a while, and it's of concern to me in some ways, because we are at a point where there is a lot of receptivity in the broader church for engagement with the Indigenous Church. With the departure of Mark MacDonald, we're looking for a new Indigenous Archbishop. Bishop Sidney Black is acting in the meantime. And I would just say that because it's, I just want to mention, we miss Mark. There's been a great deal of grief about his departure, but I have to say that there's also been a lot of dedication to moving the Indigenous church forward. We are more than one person. And that's a really important point to remember. So applying the transformational aspirations, hope in embracing mutual interdependence with the Indigenous church. The interdependence part is going to come, but it's not there yet. So is the future Indigenous? I'm going to be a bit provocative here and try and think a little bit out of the box about what this might look like. The 2016 census shows that Indigenous people are the fastest growing population in Canada at 4.9%. And 35% of the population is under 15, compared to 18% of the Canadian population. There is some StatsCan projected growth of up to 6.8% of the population by 2041. Atlantic Canada, the projections are between 5.4 and 6.8%, but Saskatchewan and Manitoba, for example, Saskatchewan up 16%, Manitoba up 19%. The reality of an Indigenous population in parts of the country is going to change the country. So I will just leave that as an assertion. And the other interesting thing is almost half of the Indigenous population is in urban areas. So and that's probably going to increase. So the implications for urban ministry, depending on the part of the country that you're in, are there. We also have the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. It's now law in Canada. And so we all have to be familiar with what's in it. And we can look at it narrowly in terms of only the things that apply to churches. But there are a broader set of principles there that I think need to also be looked at in terms of how we operate as a church. So I really do think that to date, and I've had to think about this with the arrival of the Archbishop of Canterbury, what have we actually accomplished? And I think we've done a lot in our church. And some of you may have seen the article that we wrote in the last Anglican Journal, tracking our progress. So we are ahead of the game in terms of purposeful, committed decolonization, however you want to use that lovely word. And there are opportunities to forge this new joint Indigenous, non-Indigenous Anglican identity. And that would involve things like helping to reclaim and rethink the history and agency of Indigenous people, of all of us owning our shared history through truth-telling. And just as an aside, that's one of the key activities of the Jubilee Commission, is to look into our history and tell the history from an Indigenous perspective for the purpose of developing a new narrative that all of us can buy into. And then the final point about this relationship and identity is respecting and supporting the Indigenous reconciliation journey. It's not easy. It reminds me a bit of a federal provincial relations conference that I used to attend. And I mean, we have as many languages and cultures and differences within the Indigenous population across Canada as you have in the country writ large. So this notion of one Indigenous voice is really difficult. But what it does mean is that as a church, we may have to adapt our institutional culture, our systems and structures, and our practices within the church. I see reconciliation as a holy journey. It is both an Indigenous and non-Indigenous journey. And it's a different journey for Indigenous people and for non-Indigenous people. For Indigenous Anglicans, a lot of it, as I've mentioned earlier, is about recovering things from the past, recovering the life-sustaining truths about Indigenous culture, the traditions, the spirituality, and the languages. Those who speak another language than English will understand what I mean, but language is a way of expressing culture and the way of expressing concepts. And I'll just give you a little tiny example. I used to chair something called the Vision Keepers, which is a youth elders group in the church. And I wanted to have an Indigenous structure and Indigenous titles for people. So as the chair of the group, I looked for a title. And of course, in Mohawk, there are no words for a woman as a leader. And so I ended up with a Cantonetta, which means she who makes the grasses wave. And so that's an expression of leadership. And so it's an example, though, of how rich language can be in understanding what those concepts are. Restoring human dignity, wisdom, and practice of the core Indigenous sacred beliefs. I mean, there's a whole bunch of information here that I just don't have time to get into, but by and large, for many, many Indigenous cultures, the first contact with Europe and organized religions was very positive in the sense that a lot of the traditional beliefs correspond to Christian beliefs, the notion of a creator. We have our seven grandfather teachings, which are expressed differently in different cultures. But so there was a lot of receptivity and ability to relate to Christianity. And then, of course, renewing right relations. Mark MacDonald used to talk about what those relationships were like in the early days, and do we have to go back to those and look at renewing them. The community cultural values, many of which have been terribly eroded in Indigenous communities, and to take that back and to fully express what self-determination means. And the term sovereignty in terms of self-government, self-determination is not, don't take it to mean sovereignty with the Anglican Church, because the Indigenous Church has taken a decision to remain within the Anglican Church of Canada. And that's an important decision. And that was not an easy decision. So we're here and we want to make it work. So for non-Indigenous Anglicans, it's also a journey. And it's going to involve things like bringing a new vision forward of what it means to be church. And there are choices here. And it's not just on this front, but on all the change stuff we talked about earlier. We have choices about whether we're going to adapt, evolve, reform. But my only point here is that we need to be mindful and purposeful in what that is. We're all going to evolve, whether we plan it or not. So I guess I'm asking for us to, to be more purposeful of where we want to go with this. A big part of it is going to be rebalancing structures of power of our systems that don't enable Indigenous voices all the time. And there are embedded ideologies that we need to address, and we need to be able to find room to validate marginalized Indigenous perspectives. And I've mentioned already this notion of truth-telling about our past. It ain't great. And so, we need to tell ourselves a story that reflects the perspectives of Indigenous people as well. And we've gone through a lot, Indigenous people, and I don't know who's going to write this out at some point, but we need to take the Indigenous holy journey and translate that so that other people can benefit from that. And there aren't a lot of bridges yet between the Indigenous and non-Indigenous church to be able to do that. Some of the key elements of the covenant, our way of life. First of all, we have been trying to recover and reveal what was lost or taken. And there were some critical things that we came up with that underpin our work. And we had to name those things in order to move forward. One of them was around relationships and trusting, respectful relationships that recognize conflict as natural and normal in a community. And that the gift of forgiveness, instead of obedience only to rules and structures, is a fundamental concept within Indigenous communities. And there are different ways of doing that across the country, but essentially it's proactive. It counsels people before they go astray, so there. I don't want to get too much into that, but it's a huge area that needs to be looked at. the notion of the circle and the circle of life and consensus as a way of living in harmony. And this is versus, a Western concept of structural authority. And I talked earlier about yes, no voting, and consensus. It takes a long time. That's one thing I can say about it. And it does take also, we have the elders off to the side, listening to both sides and offering their wisdom in order to make peace and to help to reconcile different views. But the notion that every individual has gifts bestowed by the Creator, and it's not up to us to judge that individual with those gifts. It's to understand those gifts and to work with those. So it's quite a different process of working together. And then one of the other important things is around taking responsibility for each other and community building. Everything is around community. That the notion of individuality traditionally did not exist. Everything you did was for the benefit of the community writ large. And this whole notion, we've heard this expression, walking in each other's shoes, but it is a real expression of deep listening, of understanding people versus judging people, and working with all of the talents that people bring to the community. It also, we also looked at the gifts that were conveyed and versus only positional authority. So for example, the chair, co-chairs of the Anglican Council of Indigenous People are not the leaders there. They are part of the community in developing this. You've heard this before, but this notion of living in balance and harmony with all of creation. It sounds so idealistic, but I can't even begin to explain how profound and fundamental that is to Indigenous ways of thinking, and recognizing that there is a special role for humankind, in overseeing the protection of the natural world, and the notion of interdependence with all of nature. And the final one, and this is again is very important, and I had a hard time understanding the distinction, but gospel-based discipleship is practiced very differently in Indigenous communities. It is the way of entering into dialogue. And as much time as needs to be spent on it at the beginning of a meeting is spent on it. And so everybody has to have their say, asked with the 3 questions. What words stand out for you? What is God saying to you? And what lessons do you learn? So all of those are real questions that every individual participating has to answer. And so those words become fundamental to the conversation that follows. So it really is, in that sense, a shared living gospel. The key elements of the covenant and our way of life, I could spend days on, and I'm not really just going to skip through it very quickly, because it's there for you to have a look at. And if you haven't read it, I would suggest finding some time to sit with it. And every single word in that was very lovingly created. And so it's all very meaningful to the drafters of that document. It has 12 chapters in it. It talks about the circle, the ways of prayer, the role of the Anglican Council of Indigenous Peoples, the role of elders, and the next slide on bishops, what boundaries mean. And this is an important one for the future, because we have different cultural contexts about what boundaries mean. Boundaries in the church right now are diocesan, and for Indigenous people, it might be the land that they traditionally occupied and hunted on, which don't have boundaries. And so you're trying to have 2 systems overlap with each other and to try to work together. Joining of people and communities, and the notion of non-hierarchical approaches. The next page is communities, congregations, and regions, and the arrangements that come out of that by language, by culture to tradition, And so there is going to be some work ahead as the Indigenous church sorts that out, and then the conversations with the broader church about what that actually translates into. A lot of focus on conflict, hurt, and violation of our way of life and what right relationships look like as essential qualities for being able to live in a stable and peaceful community. The document, as I mentioned, is a living document. It's a green document in the sense that other people coming after this group will want to keep it up to date. And then there's a chapter about the relationships with the Anglican Church of Canada and jurisdictions, and an assertion there that the Indigenous Church is a full, equal, but separate self-governing partner inside of the Anglican Church of Canada, with collegial and collaborative partnerships within the church. And the whole notion of walking alongside of each other and walking together with Canadian Anglicans. And from the Haudenosaunee side, we have this concept of two paths. What they don't come together, but they walk alongside of each other. And that was a treaty concept of working with white settlers coming to the country that probably applies more broadly across the country as well as a concept. And then finally, there's a whole section in it, and this was written by the late Ginny Doctor on the Holy Order arrangements for Indigenous people. So looking at all of that, there are some things in this. I mean, anybody in this room could come up with their own list, and this didn't take me a long time to do. But there are a lot of things that can be done, and so as we go forward with those aspirations that I talked about earlier, what is the first one is around rethinking our history. And I talked about this new narrative that has to come out, this narrative around truth-telling. And there are a number of elements to that. In addition to the Jubilee Commission's work in this archival project to look at the files of our church and the things that actually happened versus the things that we would like to say happen, quite different, but that can also be done at the diocesan level. And I have 3 dioceses in the country that want to work alongside of the Jubilee Commission in looking at their archives as well. What's beyond reconciliation? I don't know, but I would say that possibly a new process of repentance when we finish this research. I mean, how are we going to reconcile this work? And I don't know about this one, but reparations for resources misapplied. There were a lot of resources raised in the name of Indigenous people that never reached Indigenous people, and I can say that without finishing the research that we've done. So I just put that out there as an issue. The next one about ways of being together. The notion of relational ways of being together is, again, a cultural concept that I think we could all benefit from. And the Indigenous notion that we're all relatives, that there's an interconnectedness with each other and with all of creation. And a lot of this is being talked about more broadly on the environmental front, climate change and that sort of thing. But that's something that I think we could benefit from. The notion of a whole person, and a whole person being physical, spiritual, intellectual, emotional, all of the things that comprise an individual. And as I mentioned earlier, the fact that blend of capacities was bestowed by the Creator. And so when you look at every person in this room with their gifts, it's a question of pulling out those gifts. How do we appreciate the gifts of each other in working together? And I don't quite know how we incorporate conflict as more natural and normal. But I mean, one example would be looking at consensus. And there are 2 territories in the country that operate on the basis of consensus. So from a governmental perspective, it is possible to make decisions based on consensus. And then the deep, deep listening part and not judging and the walking in each other's shoes, and the value of community cohesion before individual rights. So there are probably parts of our church that could take that and say, well, that might be something we could look at that would improve our relationships and as we adopt more relational approaches. Another idea is how does Indigenous Anglicanism get expressed? And I start off with a quote, I don't even remember where I got it from, but that the gospel was transmitted in Western dress. So we have to look at how Christianity and Anglicanism was received by Indigenous people. And we've inherited a system that may or may not fit for us. I mean, what does mission mean in the context of today's Indigenous cultural context? And how do you shift from this missionary view of Indigenous people's relationship with the church to one more of full partnership? And there's a lot of that kind of culture embedded in the Indigenous culture as well. And so we're struggling with how do we tease that apart? And clarity around issues of self-determination. What does that mean beyond roles of, converting heathens, and whose voices and whose stories need to be told that haven't been told yet? And there's a whole process, I think, of revaluing Indigenous spirituality and culture and traditions. And another quote, God's glory does not come through the triumph of one group over the other as one succumbs to the mission of the gospel, but rather through the open embrace and welcome that God through Christ demonstrates to each person. So those are, this is not a specific set of actions, but I think there are questions to be asked and to be approached with intentionality to help the recovery of Indigenous ways. I talked earlier about how place defines who we are, and that is a really, really important concept. And in Canada and in the Anglican Church, the notion that we are a beautiful object because we have all this diversity of place. And it comes back to this point that there is no Indigenous monoculture, and we need to get over that. It's understanding the cultural context of the people who went before you in terms of where you are. And I mentioned the language, and even like learning 10 words of a language that can show insight to how people viewed the world at that time. So we have to move beyond land acknowledgements. Some people I know are fed up with them. I personally like them because they are a reminder every time that that there was someone there previously, but we have to figure out how to go beyond land acknowledgements. So that's a big one, I think. How to make institutional changes that are responsive to Indigenous culture and ways. How do we embark on a new journey of partnership? There are so many different things that we can do. I had one diocese actually say, we don't even think we have any Indigenous people here. Well, yes, that may be, factually that may be true, but one has to look at the history of the country and colonization to recognize that it's not somebody else's problem. It's something that everybody has to address. My biggest concern, as I mentioned earlier, is about a partnership of two solitudes. And I do think that we are in danger of that happening. As I mentioned, the Indigenous Church right now is very internally focused for good reasons. But I think we shouldn't take that as, or interpret that as an unwillingness to engage. We need bridges. And there are lots of ways we can do this. I'm on the board of St. Stephen's University here in New Brunswick, and one thing we've just done there is we've launched a new program starting this fall called Reconciliation Relatives, and it's focused on non-Indigenous students to learn how to be good relatives, learn how to be good partners. And again, it's not about learning how to be a good Indigenous person. It's how do we work together. So there is a paucity of that kind of initiative in the country, and so both sides are going to have to reach out. The next one is around decision making and consensus decision making. I've already really touched on that. There may be parts of the country, and there may be maybe General Synod should think about this model when we have tough decisions to make. And do we really need to polarize people to the extent that we have with Western style voting from the past? Gospel-based discipleship, I've already touched on that. There's a lot, I think, to be learned from that. We're not just skipping over the gospel. It is profoundly fundamental to the way Indigenous people gather. We have gospel-based discipleship 3 times a week, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, at 1 o'clock our time in Atlantic Canada. And we always welcome non-Indigenous participation in that as well. So it's something that we organize ourselves, and we take turns. Archbishop Mark used to do that, but now we all are all stepping up to the plate. And you can see firsthand how it works. Rethinking physical infrastructure. There may be some insight here that we can learn from. I personally can go back to my Camp Canterbury Hills in Ontario, of worshiping outside at 7 o'clock every morning at summer camp, and it's a little bit like that. The notion that you would have to be in creation to really appreciate the connections to the natural world. But there are a lot of I think perhaps by necessity, different cultural concepts about ministry. And we do have still, unfortunately, a number of non-stipendiary Indigenous clergy in the country. And that needs to be addressed. But there's a notion of valuing ministry over buildings. And a lot of the Indigenous churches, they don't have a church. They use the school gym, the band council office, or out on the trap line on the land. But the concept of wherever 2 or 3 are gathered is really is profoundly fundamental. We know that, and we do practice that, but it's so meaningful in a different kind of way to Indigenous people. And for example, gospel-based discipleship, my first reaction was, well, there are only 6 of us on today. And, my first reaction is say, well, that shouldn't happen. We need more people. Well, that isn't the point. The point is that the 6 who are there are really, really important, and they want to be there. And we have to worship the fact that they are there. So the whole, how do we connect more to the holistic view of nature? Is there something there? Is there a concept there that might be helpful as we look through diocesan parish restructuring, as we look at what creative Indigenous ministry has done? Climate change and ecology, this is already being actively addressed. I did some work for the Ontario government a few years ago on traditional knowledge, TK, and that, traditional knowledge is finding its way into scientific approaches to managing climate. So it isn't something that is being sidelined anymore, but there is a renaissance, I think, occurring in many parts of the country around these traditional knowledge systems, and the notion of responding to very complex ecosystems, where traditionally Westerns we have siloed approaches to many scientific endeavors. So there is something there. I've walked with an Indigenous elder about 3 years ago in Northern Ontario. He could tell by walking on the ground and the sound that the pine cones made walking on it about precipitation. So there's a connection there in some parts of the country with those who still live in harmony with nature. One of the things that came up in the listening groups was, why are we not, as a church, why do we not advocate more on issues of biodiversity and Indigenous roles in conservation and traditional knowledge? And of course, there's the big one of supporting Indigenous stances in various resources development projects across the country. Focus on the whole person. The Indigenous healing journey, of course, continues, and support is still needed for that journey. So I hope people won't give up on that. Some people will never heal. I mean, there are some people who have been so damaged by the experience, and so we need to continue to support and live with those people. But we're also discovering that this is linked to a broader spiritual movement and mindfulness and contemplation and meditation. There are a lot of lessons that can be learned from Indigenous spiritual movements. And the notion that approaches to health and healing are connected. I sit on the board of Anishinaabe Health in Toronto, and we try to blend Western medicine with Indigenous healing methods. And it's an amazing, beautiful thing that nobody's rejecting Western medicine, but the notion of healing a whole person and treating the whole person and healing in nature. We have sweat lodges in downtown Toronto. So that's an example of something that we can learn, I think, from Indigenous healing. Anglican spiritual beliefs. I know this is something that it can be very controversial in different parts of the country, but there are churches that have begun to incorporate Indigenous spirituality and beliefs. It's obviously within the Indigenous church there, because of where the services are often performed. There are adaptations already made, but this is something that I think we can look for, whether it's smudging. I remember when at the very first Council of General Synod meeting I went to, there was resistance about doing the smudging in the room, and so they insisted that the smudging be done before people got in, and a number of churches have done that. And of course, there are practical things around health that people have about that, but it's a gradual process, and I understand that not everybody's comfortable with making those kinds of adaptations. But again, it comes back to a conversation with Indigenous congregants and participants about what kinds of things would make people feel more comfortable in their worship. So finally, it is a proposition for hope. One thing that I would say that is very striking to me is how optimistic the Indigenous church is, because we're building something. And I mean, even after Mark's departure, yes, we were devastated, but there is such a strong hope there. And it was quite in opposition to a lot of what I was experiencing leading the strategic planning working group work. So there's a lot to be said for the potential in building this Indigenous church for all of us, not just for Indigenous people. And as I mentioned earlier, approaching all this in thoughtful and innovative ways. We're going to evolve whether we like it or not. Are we going to evolve mindfully and purposefully and get ahead of the ball, or are we going to be dragged into the future? So it's up to us to decide how we want to approach that. And I'm concluding with something that my husband's in the room, but we were in Sicily for a classic seminar on Lampedusa's The Leopard, and I had to find a way to use this because it's just, if everything must change for things to stay the same, was this famous line from The Leopard. And we're kind of in that position here, whether we like it or not. To stay the way we're going to have to change a lot of things. If we're going to do that, to remain in the same place, What's the point of that? Let's change so we can move forward, and recognize the opportunities and the gifts that we have before us, and embrace the change opportunities that we now have from the Indigenous Church. So let me conclude with that, and thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, Judith. Thank you. She warned me that she didn't have much time to prepare, so her presentation would be quite succinct. I shudder to think what would happen if you'd had the time. We could build a whole conference around the things you touched on. I think one of the challenges that most of us have, I know I have here in our part of New Brunswick, is that the first missionaries who came to our country were Roman Catholic, this part of the world, and so many of us don't have the experience and the insights that you've had, and other people in other Anglicans in other parts of the country have had with the Indigenous Church. And just the contact that I've had with you and with Archbishop MacDonald when he visited St. Andrews on 2 occasions has given me new insights. I know that we all are very thankful that you've given us this overview of what's happening in our church. And I guess it's a challenge for us in Atlantic Canada to know how we can engage if we're not involved in national things, which many of us are not. So I'm not sure if that's really a question, just a statement that perhaps other people are thinking about. Do people have questions? David.
What a statement that recognizing this process, recognizing in this process, something that perhaps the church needs to do. I know this is a diverse group, but my sense is that this group has been somewhat excluded from the conversation. We weren't represented in that list of diverse points of view. That's historically, this group has not been part of the conversation so often in the church as a whole. There were so many parallel things that I thought probably should happen in the church in relation to this particular group. It's insights about things, the appreciation of the gifts we bring to the church locally, actually, historically, how this group represents valid perspective.
Sure.
Really appreciate it. I was finding almost a problem with this. I guess that the end of the last present part of the thing with the aspirations and the business language applied to the church, and the whole second part of the presentation, I found it was almost two different. Well, I think it is two different worlds. And I think why I've had a little bit of involvement with some of the Sacred Circle, the gospel-based discipleship meetings, and after you've been on some of the same ones we've been on with Bishop Mark, and I found it, very engaging for us as non-Indigenous people who welcome so graciously, even in the midst of great pain in these discoveries or rediscoveries or whatever we properly call them. That we were, both Joel and I were treated very generously and graciously, and they feel we were all relations. But I think because the language of reconciliation and healing, that's the gospel, right? And I think that's why the gospel is at the center of this second process. And I'm more concerned with the rest of the process nationally. I hope this bleeds into all the rest of it. And we heard, I think, from Father Thorne yesterday, and I think he was quoting Augustine, that until we can go without eating and drinking, we're not really, none of us really healthy. We're intended to be immortal, to live with God, and so we're all in the process of healing and reconciliation with God, with one another, with nature, and certainly primarily, in this country between Indigenous and non-Indigenous. So thank you for that. Like I say, I hope this part of the picture bleeds to the other part of it and transforms it.
So what you're saying is that if we're walking together in parallel, if the national church continues to walk along as bureaucracy, well, the Indigenous church goes back to its roots and cooperative ministry, then we're not really, it's gonna be a bleeding over from Indigenous church into.
Two streams, and the indigenous one floods over in the Harrison.
That's right.
Overwhelms it,
Yeah.
so.
Neil,
I suppose this is building on that point. I was struck by the difference between the general account of transformational change and the way forward that the Indigenous church was engaged in, which is that the Indigenous church saw itself as broken and damaged and needed to engage not only in the process of going forward, but also in a process of memory and recollection. And you know, one of the things that you know, in the process of harm, obviously the victim is harmed, but so also is the perpetrator. And the church became an instrument of which we would call coercive progressivism in becoming the vehicle of the residential schools process. And that surely damaged the church. And I think there's other forms of damaging and forgetfulness and loss. So I wonder whether just simply going ahead forward without a process of recollection and reflection isn't going to be a way in which that harm will just simply re-manifest itself in forms. And so it just seems to me that there's a kind of model that the Indigenous church is upholding for the church as a whole, which is that there needs to be a process not only of going into the future, but a recovery and a moment of recollection and memory.
thank you. Would you like to react to any of the comments that have been made before I ask for any others?
No, I don't think, I mean, I've taken all of those to heart, and as I said, I would always appreciate hearing from any of you upon reflection once you go your separate ways, because this is something we need, these kinds of ideas. Thank you.
Any other comments? Well,
I just wonder if I could throw out something with Judith. I think we've all heard the expression in the New York Minute, which I think means, like, you know, right now, I guess from the story Father John told about the Delaware, if that's true, then in a Delaware weekend would be a whole different kind of thing. and when you suggested being at General Synod with you in 2019 for the first time, consensus model at General Synod, how many months is that going to take?
Well, thank you very much. Let's show our appreciation for Judith's presentation once again. We're going to move on to the summary that Amy Bird is going to grace